welcome to another edition of The Well, and this time at the spring retreat or summer retreat, again, 2019 ARCHE summer retreat. Real talk number 2. The topic today is basically a discussion on the problem of evil, and in more particular, why do bad things happen, especially to good people. And so I'm again privileged to have my friend B here on the podcast with us as we have kind of this live podcast here at the retreat to talk about this discussion. And then we have a few people in the crowd, and so we're going to try to get some questions and things like that to dialogue a little bit. But yeah, let's kind of just start off. Obviously, B, this is many books are written on this topic, like tons of them, and the books are really thick. So obviously, we're not going to be able to kind of cover the whole thing and be comprehensive in it, but yeah, just some initial thoughts on kind of this question, and you can go at it from any angle, whether it's just the problem of evil or that kind of more specific question of why do good things or why do bad things happen, and then I think many people have this question, why do bad things happen to good people in particular? So just kind of the problem of sin and evil in the world, and yeah, just kind of your take on it.
Yes, many people use the problem of evil as an argument against the existence of God, against a good God, to be exact. But the only way we can arrive at an idea of evil or an absolute idea of anything is to have an absolute God who has already given us this idea that there is good and that there is love and that there's this contrast. I think the place we always want to go whenever we get into these dilemmas is the cross. On the cross we see a God that is that absolutely hates evil, because God became sin, who knew no sin. But then we see a God who is absolutely love because he was willing to sacrifice his own son. And so the problem of evil is something that I continue to think about too. But yeah, I know that in Genesis 3, sin occurred. And yes, I know that I got a lot of friends who have a problem with God because of evil. But when I see the way God has repurposed evil in the work of salvation, I find a lot of hope in that.
Yeah, I think with this, I always kind of come back to it's kind of like yesterday's podcast when we were talking about don't go ragging on your parents about them ragging on you about academics if you're not studying, that kind of idea. I kind of come back to that with this in a similar way, in the sense that I kind of always ask people, is your problem of evil with evil in general, as in there can't be any evil in the world, or is it more problematic for you that evil or bad things happen to people maybe who don't deserve it, right? Because I think most people on the planet subscribe to an idea that bad things should happen to bad people, kind of, or like that's justice, right? We understand that's justice. But then they always go, well, if God is loving, then why does he allow bad things? And then I think we're working on the a bad premise. For me, in sense, I think logically it makes sense to me in my mind this way. I think when people ask, why do good things happen to bad people? Then I think the premise is, well, then you assume that bad things should happen to bad people, right? And then good things should happen to good people. And then furthermore, it should be bad things should only happen to bad people, and then good things should only happen to good people, which means that you also subscribe to the idea that good things cannot happen to bad people. Because then bad things can't happen to good people.
Yes.
Which means that we would all want to live in a world where there are no second chances. There is no such thing as grace. There's no mercy, nothing at all. The moment you mess up once and you do something bad, then you are now in the bad person category, and you can no longer have good things happen to you. And so if you don't subscribe to that idea, which basically nobody ever does, then you also have to leave open the idea and the economy of the world and the way that it works, that then bad things can also happen to good people. You can't have it both ways. And so I always kind of find this interesting, and depends on kind of how people attack this question in terms of why do bad things happen. Well, I think generally our frustration is to whom the bad things happen. And then, of course, if we more specify it, then obviously it comes to the fact that bad things happen to our families or people that are close to us and things of that nature. But again, nobody's ever really upset if you take a serial rapist or whatever, pedophile, all that kind of stuff, and they get either put into a life sentence or they get the death penalty. Nobody's ever upset with that. Actually, we celebrate that because then we go, oh, that's the way it's supposed to be. But then we get back to, again, when we go back to the cross, and we've been talking about it this entire retreat, well, then we run into problems, because then two things. One, again, bad things can happen to good people if good things can happen to bad people, but also it assumes that you and I, or all of us, are good people. And that's kind of the other problematic thing, because then what it depends on is on whose scale of goodness and badness are we talking about?
Yes.
Right? Like, is it your version of bad? And when you get put in the bad category, is it like my version of bad? And that's kind of, I think, at the heart of it in terms of what it is. So I always find this very interesting dynamic. And then I always, whenever someone has this issue, I always go, okay, what is the real issue here? And what's kind of your, what's it called? Experience with it, or kind of the angle that you're taking. So.
Yeah, the people in the Bible had a hard time with this too. We look in Psalm chapter, I believe, 73, Psalm 73, where the psalmist is having a hard time. In verse 12, Psalm 73, he says, behold, these are the wicked, always at ease. They increase in riches. All in vain have I kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. For all day long I have been stricken and rebuked every morning. And so he's thinking about how he's been keeping the law, following God, but it's all in vain because he sees evil people getting away with their crimes, and people continuing to flourish. And I think about what R.C. Sproul, the late theologian, he said when one of his classmates asked him the same question, why do bad things happen to good people? And R.C. Sproul said, that only happened one time, and he volunteered for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think the question, like you said, is the basis or the foundation of that question is erroneous. Yeah, that there's such thing as a good person. Because we know that the bad news of the good news is that everybody deserves the wrath of God. The wages of sin is death.
Yeah.
And so that's what we quite frankly deserve.
Right.
And I think that's just too hard, too much to stomach, I think, for the average person. So, but yes, as a fellow human, I know that that's something very difficult for me to believe every day as well.
Yeah. Well, because classically, in Job's friends had an issue because they thought that the reason why Job's life was so miserable was because he had done something wrong.
Yes.
Or they kept saying like, oh, surely you must have done something wrong. That's why God punishing you. And Job was like, nah, bro, like I'm not perfect, but I didn't do nothing to deserve this. And they had an issue there, and that got them into trouble. And then obviously the Pharisees were also the ones that were thinking the same thing. Like, basically you did bad things and therefore you got these things. And so they, back in the Jesus time, they all thought disease was a result of like some sort of sin that you must have, done. And so, this idea goes way, 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 way back. But I think one of the interesting thing about as Christians, this discussion always hits home to me. It's funny because this morning you spoke on Luke 18, and we're actually going through parables during the summer this summer, and so I actually preached on that parable not too long ago.
Cool.
And it's for those listening on YouTube and don't have a frame of reference, it's the one where the tax collector and the Pharisee go up to pray, and then of course the Pharisees saying like, I do this and I do this, yada yada yada, I'm good, I tithe and I fast, and then of course the tax collector can't even lift his eyes. A writer by the name of Rabbi Capone, when I was reading, and I always kind of context this or frame this whenever I preach a sermon. He says at the end, basically like the tax collector, let's say he comes up and then he prays and he does this thing, he beats his chest and he can't pray, and then he goes home justified. And then the question that he raised was the one that always sticks out to me, and he says, what happens if the next week he comes back and he hasn't changed? Then are you mad that he's justified and then he goes home? Mm-hmm. And then as you kind of go through that, and he goes, okay, how do you feel about that? And I think most people will be like, oh yeah, I'm mad because he don't deserve it and da da da. And then he goes, then what happens if let's say he goes and you kind of track his life, and then let's say less booze, less stealing, maybe he just collects the right amount, and so on and so forth. Then do you feel better, right, about that? And then is your sense of whatever justice done? And then the funny thing is like, and then most of us I think would agree and say, oh yeah, we feel better about that. But then he says, and rightly he says, well, why do we feel better about him now that he has a list of things to prove, like the Pharisee, right? Now that he has a better list of things, to, if the Pharisees' list wasn't impressive to begin with, what makes this person's list impressive that it would make him more justified? So it's kind of this idea through and through that I think we always are like this, and this is the thing that we're attacking at this retreat a little bit, or not a little bit, a lot of it. Basically, this idea that we are so adamant on having these things mark who we are and kind of put us up on a thing, and then so of course the better then we are in relation to these things that we've built up for ourselves on our resume, our spiritual resume or whatever, moral resume, then the more we believe that things can't happen, that and then of course it goes back to your discussion yesterday on theology of suffering and all that. So I find it's really interesting that we all fundamentally believe this to the core of who we are as human beings, that the problem of evil is rooted in the variance of morality or goodness in the people, when again, Paul says it, all have fallen short. All have missed the mark, as you said this morning. And so it's kind of this discussion. So it almost makes the discussion moot.
Yeah.
But of course it's not. It's an important discussion. But also I think that I always feel like we have to start there before we can really have a discussion.
No, it's a poignant remark, because, what I was thinking about as you were talking is how much we hate grace.
Yeah.
Well, I think about even for me, when it's my birthday and people celebrate the day of my birth, I think sometimes it seems foolish or simple, because I didn't do anything. I was just born, and then people are happy that I was born, and I'm like, it's uncomfortable. That grace makes me uncomfortable, and I think my point is that in general, we have a hard time believing or hard time accepting that God lets the rain fall on the righteous and the unrighteous, and lets His light, let the sun shine on the righteous and the unrighteous alike, and the scandal of grace, right? Yeah, and that I just happened to be born into the right family.
Right.
Yeah, God let me have two parents with good genetics.
Yeah.
So I'm not born blind. I don't have a disability.
Right. Like my mom wasn't on drugs
Yeah.
or drinking alcohol, whatever.
And then I have friends. I actually have a friend who was born a crack baby. Yeah. And I don't think we're comfortable with the fact that our God is in the heavens and He does whatever He pleases.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we hate that.
We hate that.
Yeah.
We don't want God to be God.
Yeah, right.
And I'm not saying these questions are unnecessary, but they can only go so far.
Right.
There comes a place where, you believe that he must know something I don't about what's best for us, and I have to rest in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But but yes, like we spoke about this morning, like in Luke 18, there is this sense of entitlement. Even if we're not self-righteous, there's a sense of entitlement of God is on trial, and I have a right to know how He's running His business.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you run your shop?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. That's tough. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting. Again, it's a very important thing. But every time I start to dialogue about it, and I think thanks be to God and some of the wisdom that He's given to me. Like there's a logical understanding of kind of how it goes. But then even as you keep digging, you always kind of basically run to the same problem, and that's the mystery of who God is. Like God is God, and He's gonna do God's gonna do God, right? Mm-hmm. And there's not much that you can say after a little while. After a while, and if you're not okay with that, then we have fundamental issues. But then of course, I think everyone would agree that we don't want to be God either. Like I haven't met a single human being who actually wants to be God and what it means to be God. Like I don't think anyone actually wants that much power and responsibility and all that other stuff. But I think it's this interesting kind of dynamic, in terms of why God allows these things to happen. But I think it's a good time with kind of the length of our thing today to kind of open up some questions. I think that might be helpful, even with us, a little bit of the people that are here, to see kind of if they have anything that they want to dialogue. So there's a mic out here, so if you have a question, you can just go ahead and say it into the mic, and then we'll try to dialogue off of it. If not, then B and I can continue to talk. That's not a problem. That's for sure.
I have a question.
Is the mic on?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so my question is that can there still be good and evil? Can like there be justice even without God and without Jesus? Because a recent question that me and my friends once talked about was about abortion and whether abortion was a good or evil thing. And let's not bring in Christianity. Let's just look at this objectively and to
Right.
determine if it's right or wrong.
Hmm.
Well, I don't think that's possible, but if you tried, I think you always run into pragmatism, right? So, you know, would the ends justify the means, right? So if the end is to honor God, glorify God, be right with God, then abortion isn't good, right? It's bad because God doesn't want murder or God doesn't want death in the womb. But then when you look at if you want to like decrease crime or you want to revamp the face of society, then maybe genocide is good, right? Holocaust isn't such a bad idea if you believe that there are certain group of people that are an infestation to the rest of the world. And I mean, the Jews, during the Holocaust, the law comes from the Jews.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that has something to do with
Yeah.
why we wanted to wipe out the Jews. Not we, but why Hitler and the Germans wanted to wipe out the Jews. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think you got to always be careful of trying to become the measure of all things, because that's the original sin, the knowledge of good and evil, right? That I can be the measure of all things. And I think that's why we get so frustrated with this question, because I cannot be at the center of this knowledge. Right? It's too wonderful for me. Yeah.
I think an interesting way to kind of look at it. You asked, if you can have justice without like a God, and it's a very interesting thing because even if you look at our justice system, right, we have the Supreme Court, which is the highest court, but in all the court system, we still have a jury, and the reason why is because you don't want the power to be in one person's hand. That's called a tyranny or dictatorship, and nobody's ever a fan of that. And I think the idea is you can't have justice if you don't have a standard for it, because then you can make up whatever justice means. Like that's what B was just talking about. Then you get into pragmatism and things like that. Like you have to have some sort of standard, right, that says this is right and this is wrong. And without said standard, then you're not going to be able to actually understand what is what, right? And then without that, then even with the problem of abortion, then if you don't have a standard of what is right or wrong, then it's really hard to justify. And then of course, with abortion, every single time you talk about abortion, right? Most people, I think, on earth agree that abortion is not generally a good thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, even if you get away from, like, the when, like, the time, like, when is a fetus an actual human being? Like, even if, okay, get away from that part, most people, I think, generally agree that abortion is not good. It's not, like, a cool thing to just be killing babies, right? Things like that, or killing living things in general. But I think the problem that we always run into, and then the problem that pro-choicers or whoever maybe for abortion always come to, is what happens if someone gets raped and then you have a child, right? That's always what it is. And so again, then from that point on, then it just depends. It's an argument. It's a ends justify the means, depends on the situation, circumstantial. But then that, by definition, isn't justice, because it's based on whatever you believe. And so we always have kind of these definition problems, right? I think everybody wants generally things to fit and make sense for their own life. And then in doing so, sometimes we seek justice, but we really don't really want justice, because then that also then implicates us on other things. And so I think it's this very interesting dynamic. That's why I was going back to it earlier, even from the original question, is generally people come from it because they don't want evil to happen to people that they care about. But most people don't care if evil happens to people that they don't care about. You really only care if evil inflicts those whom you care about, or those whom you deem, right? And so, like for instance, this is maybe I shouldn't do this, but when you were talking about the whole Holocaust thing, I thought of the Avengers, right? Because when Thanos poop half
Yeah.
the population, basically the issue is who gets to decide what half the population goes away and what half the population stays, and that's kind of the problem that most of even the Avengers who are alive have. Is like, why did so and so's why did these people die and why did I stay alive, that kind of thing. And again, then you have this issue like that's kind of what you have, and you can't have that. And so anytime you have talks about evil, talks about justice, mercy, all those type of things, you have to deal with this issue. First, you must establish who sets the standard, and then you have to kind of go from there. But again, when you have these conversations amongst your friends or in general, we don't ever first establish what the standard is. Everybody wants their standard to be right, and then you're never going to have a proper discussion. It's not possible.
Yeah. It's just, who says, right? Even in Jesus' time, the rabbis, there were different ranks, right? And they would speak on the authority of a particular rabbi. But Jesus spoke on his own authority.
Right.
And that's why he astounded
Right.
the people, because he didn't speak according to Rabbi X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
He said, I speak on my own authority. And that's why, I guess that's, so Jesus dropped the mic every time he spoke, because he never deferred to someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why people were angry, but also drawn
Yeah.
to what he was saying.
Yeah. He basically said the buck stops with me. Period.
Yeah.
And
You have heard, like Moses said this. Well, I say,
Yeah.
if you look at a woman lustfully,
Right.
yep, you commit adultery.
Like, because that's crazy. Because he says, like before, if you actually commit adultery, and we live in a society, like legit, like, this is probably not a good discussion, but legit, we live in a society where, like, I'm both of us are married. If I went out and held hands with another woman, is that cheating? If I kiss them, is that cheating?
Yeah.
Like some people would say, oh, unless you actually like sleep with them, that ain't cheating. You know what I mean? Like then, what's the standard? But then Jesus says, if you look at another woman lustfully, if you look at another man lustfully, boom, guilty. Sorry. That's why all have fallen short. And so, but that's what people don't like, because depending on who you are, right, then you have different standards. And that's why when B was telling us a story yesterday about his mom and his parents and things like that, like, again, depending on what background you come from, it can be different. And so you want that to apply to you. So that's a really good question. But I think oftentimes we don't set the parameters for these conversations before we have them. And then it's just like this massive, fray, just like everyone for it themselves in terms of figuring out what it is. And so everyone's coming at it from a different angle. And then it's really hard to have an actual conversation about these things. Good question. Some others? Go ahead, Daniel.
I'm Daniel, and my question is, how would you respond, like when a bad thing happens to you? Like, let's say this is just a what if scenario,
Yeah.
but like, let's say you have like a relative who passes away. Like, how do you go on with that? Like, how would you
Yeah,
approach that?
I can jump on this real quick. I think the thing where I've landed every time, and this even goes back to, and again, this might be might some hatred for this one, but when you go to the quote unquote, someone got raped, they get pregnant, and then I stand for life and therefore no abortion, and then on top of that you add the complication of the mother's life is in danger. That's like kind of like that's everyone's kind of trump card.
Yeah.
Right? That's like the ultimate, like, what do you do then? Kind of like, let's put you in a bind that you can't answer. For me, the easiest way, and I think I've come to this, is if it's God doing God, and I'm cool with that. Because there's nobody else on the face of the planet throughout the history of the world who does what he does. No one else dies for wretched people, like known wretched people. no one else dies for the criminals, and the people who get crucified are not your normal, A-type criminals. They're as B was talking in the sermon, like they're like your whatever, like they're the bottom of the bottom criminals. And so I think one for me is like knowing that I'm not God. But then I think secondly for me the thing that I always come back to is this, and this is why salvation and evangelism and all this stuff is so important. When Jesus says the mark of your love or the standard of your love is that you would die for another brother. I had to confront this to myself, and this is why sometimes I say it out loud, and it's like a way of like reminding myself verbally this is true. If God ever calls me to die for someone, and that particular someone particularly does not know Jesus, I hope and I pray that 100% out of 100% I would say yes, go ahead and God take my life, if it's going to really do the work of saving that other person. Why? Because if I die today, if I die this moment out there, yes, people might be sad or whatever, but I know where I'm going to be. So though suffering may come, in the end, I know where my home is supposed to be and where my future is. And so if that's the case, then I handle it that way. And so, and then I hope that I'm in a place where even if suffering comes knocking on my door, that I would welcome it, especially if it's going to help someone else that, that doesn't know who Christ is. And then also, we talked about it all the time, you don't know what God is going to do through suffering. Like you have no idea what God is going to do through suffering. This is the way that I always understand it. B and I both kind of grew up in a interesting background. And as most of you know, if you know my story a little bit, my dad's been divorced a bunch of times. And, just kind of like the history is kind of crazy. My dad's had a bunch of relationships. If anyone knows, my dad's second marriage, the reason why that all kind of messed up is because the first time he got his second wife pregnant, he forced her to have an abortion. And the second time she got pregnant, he was going to force her to have another abortion, and then she said no, so he left her, right? So, like, there was a whole lot of issues for why I hated that guy and why I hated my dad for a while, and thankfully, God has brought forgiveness and reconciliation in our family and all that kind of stuff. But so all of this really hits home. Where was I going with this? There was somewhere I was going with this. And for me, So I don't know. So I think oftentimes with suffering, we hate it because, it's not good, but and this is a real thing. One time I was doing my thing in Vancouver, and then a friend of mine who's a pastor as well, he called me one day, and he was like, "Hey Pete, I got a question for you." And I was like, "Yeah, what's up?" And then so he was describing to me the situation about a student of his, and she was going through some stuff. Her parents were going through something. There was just mess everywhere. And then he looked, and he was on the phone with me, and he straight up said, "I have no idea what to do, what to say, or even how to begin, but I know you do because you lived this." He's like, help a brother out, basically. And then in that moment, I was like, yeah, I do know, because I literally have lived that situation. And then so in that moment, what he and I were kind of discussing is on some level, I am a more equipped pastor to deal with situations because of the suffering that I went through. Another classic example is in Vancouver. One of the things that was happening, there are a lot of like immigrants from Korea, and they have this thing called kirogi families, which is a Korean term for basically like families that have like a mom and like all the kids are like west, like in Canada or in the States, and then dad's in Korea making money. Like that's the kind of family setup. And I remember in my first couple of years, we had a bunch of these families in our church, and I was so judgmental. It was harsh. I was like, man, look at these families, look at these dads, look at these moms. Like they don't know what they're doing. Like how can they say they love their families? Like so harsh and so judgmental on so many levels. And then of course I moved down to Houston. Y'all know the story. My family got separated. I became a kirogi family. And like I kid you not, one day I was praying and I laughed. And I was like, God, you funny. Because I vowed I would never do that. But I also knew, because I didn't go through it, I had no idea how hard it was. I had zero sympathy for anyone like that. And so the 15 months or whatever that we were separated, and that suffering, it brought in and out of me, and it produced a weight of glory, right? As Paul says, like that I wouldn't have been able to understand. And so I now respond, no matter what happens, I respond in a way and say, God, you have something. Either I got to learn something because I'm stubborn and I'm stupid, or you're trying to do something in me, or whatever the case might be, but I trust that you're going to bring something better out of this. And so I try to receive it with that humility, going, God, you're going to do your thing. And I'm just really thankful to be a part of it for however long it is that I get to be a part of it. So I think that's kind of how I've chosen to respond to a lot of those things.
Yeah, I would say spend a lot of time in Romans 8. When you think about the promise of the gospel, is that you're reconciled to God the Father through God the Son, right? And Paul tells us at the end of Romans 8 that in verse 28 that, for we know that God works all things for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. And then he talks about all these celestial and gargantuan things that we would assume can separate us from the love of God, like height and depth, angels and demons, principalities, government, tyranny, our own sin, our conscience. And he tells us that nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, right? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, won't he give us all good things? And so my application to you, Daniel, in the midst of hardship and loss and suffering, is that God is going to give a Christian cancer and a non-Christian cancer to show the world a difference. He's going to give a non-Christian deep loss, and he's going to give a Christian deep loss to show the world the difference. Because what we tell the world when we suffer well is that God is my glory. It's not staying alive. It's not being successful. It's not being strong. That God alone is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. And so I think when we suffer well, because think about it, Daniel, you're going to suffer for something. Does that make sense? You have to suffer if you want a nice body. You have to suffer if you want to get good grades. You have to suffer if you want to get married. You have to suffer if you want to stay married. So we all have to suffer for something we find glorious, that we find absolutely beautiful, right? And when we suffer well, we're telling the world, God is my glory. God is beauty alone to me, right? And Jesus lost all that on the cross so that we would never be separated from it, you know? And so that's the promise of the gospel. That it's not that we would never experience bad things, but that no bad thing can ever separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, you know? And so I take great heart in that. 2 Corinthians 4 is also a good chapter I encourage you to read about all of our pain and affliction is light and momentary. Yeah. So I know it doesn't feel that way, but it is. Yeah. Great question, bro.
Yeah, I think I'm always reminded of the one line in the Lord's Prayer where it says, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one.
Yeah.
The more work I do on the Lord's Prayer, the more I understand that word. The word for temptation there is the Greek word pyrasmos, and that word can be translated both temptation and trial, right, or test. And the difference between the two, particularly the way the Greeks understood it, is that temptation is something that's designed for you to fail, but a test is something that's designed to approve and improve whatever it's testing. So, like if you have a test in algebra or whatever, it's meant to prove that you have a knowledge and then hopefully improve whatever that knowledge is. And so God will test you to prove and improve your faith. But then we're asking that God would protect us from the enemy so that the enemy doesn't turn that test into a temptation designed for us to fail. So what all of it means that we're going to get some stuff that we're not going to like, right? But I think what B was talking about, and that's amazing. That's truth. That's hard, that's deep truth. That we're all going to suffer for something, but we should suffer for something that's glorious. And then for us, that's freeing, which is why we can say, go ahead and, suffering may come, but it is well, right? And the reason why we can say that is because we know that whatever we suffer for, if it's suffering for the glory of Christ, it's worth it. Because we have a treasure that won't ever die, a treasure that cannot rust, and a treasure that cannot be stolen, right? A treasure that will not fade. Right? It's why in the parable, that's why the guy who finds the treasure, who finds the kingdom, goes back, sells everything, and then buys the plot of land where he has the treasure because he knows that ain't going nowhere, right? And so it's that idea, right? And so, that the one thing I think everyone misses in that parable, at least for me, is he had to sell whatever he had, and I'm sure whatever he had was good. It's not like it was a pile of garbage, because if it was a pile of garbage, he wouldn't have had the money to buy whatever it is that he's trying to buy. So he had to sell and suffer in that kind of way and move and change, and nobody like change, but it was worth it. And so, it's kind of that then God is my glory, and then you'll see the difference in terms of the way that we live. And then there's a freedom in it.
Yeah.
Sorry, last little anecdote. My grandmother was the strongest Christian I've ever known. and she died of lung cancer. And that woman was like, that woman, if there was anybody that was a saint, that woman was a saint. I mean, just unreal. And I remember on her deathbed, she was, she had lung cancer. So there was like, I tell the story a lot, but there's this little like doohickey where you would kind of like blow into, like this tube, and it's supposed to like, show how much like power you have in your lungs. And if you just, blow into it real quick, there's these 3 balls kind of like in this like little tube, and the balls go up, and it's really easy to do. Like I tried it. It was like so simple, right? And I was in 8th grade at the time, and she could barely get the first like, ball like up halfway of the cylinder. Like that's how much she was struggling. So she could hardly breathe, could hardly talk. And then I think we all kind of knew she was about to die real soon. And then all my aunts and like, they were all in the room, and they were just bawling their eyes out, right? And then at one point they're all, crying like crazy, and then my grandmother like raised her hand, and everyone kind of shut up for a second. And then she, in her weakness, but she got this out, and this was one of the last things that she ever said. And she goes, "Why are you crying?" And then all my aunts, they're crazy. They're like, "What do you mean? Like you're dying? Are you crazy? What's wrong with you? You're dying." And then she goes, "I've lived a good life. It's time for me to go home." And she goes, "I pray that you'll be there. I pray that I'll meet you when it's your time. But don't be sad for me. I get a new body, and I get a new everything. You have to live here in this mess." And so I'm good. And so for me, it was kind of like all that suffering, it was good for her. And she knew where she was going to be. And like there was so much confidence in her words. It was I was dumbfounded. I was like cursing in my mind. I was like, what in the world is going on? I never heard nobody talk like that before. And so, I think even with the suffering that comes, if we have the assurance of glory, then you're able to handle it in such a way that I think, because where your foundation is, you know how the story ends, right? We always say like the end has already been written. We know how it ends. And so whatever happens in the middle, like we're good, like it's, you'll suffer for anything because you know how the, story is going to end. Like if in sports, like if you're guaranteed you're going to win the chip, then you'll do whatever. Because, in the end, you get the glory of the chip. And so that's kind of how, the approach that I try to take. Do you have any other questions? If not, we're going to try to wrap it up with a few final comments. And if you do, go ahead, go for it. Nothing is off limits. If it's too racy, we'll just say we can't answer that here. Come see me in private. But other than that, I think anything is pretty much good.
All right, sister.
Let's say that there's.
Is it on? It should have a green dot.
Let's. It is? Oh. Let's say there's like 2 options, but they're both bad.
Yeah.
How are you supposed to choose between those 2?
The question is, let's say there's 2 options, but they're both bad. How do you choose between the 2? Just to reiterate for the recording, Jenny was saying, what if you have a situation where a mom, obviously wants to have an abortion, but then she can't legally, and so she has the kid, but she goes through massive postpartum, and so the kid's neglected, and therefore he's going to be suffering, or she's going to be suffering, and so which is better in this case? Like, is it better to knowingly bring a child into the world into a bad circumstance, and so on and so forth, or is it better to not? This is going to sound so simple, at least for me. I still say you have to side with what God's going to do. Because, and I've told you this story, but when I went through ordination and when I did the psychological evaluations, and I've told you this story before, and the psychologist, a secular psychologist who had been doing this for like 20-some years, looked at me and goes, "How does someone who grew up like you turn out so okay?" Because 99% of the time someone likes you, you're supposed to be a sex addict, a drug addict, an addict of all kinds. And so again, I'm not in any way saying that my life, is comparable to some of the, some people in the world who've really just, but I think also psychologically, sociologically, statistically, I'm not supposed to be like this. And I told him, and he was like, "How are you like that?" And I was like, "Speaking of Enneagrams, I came out as a 7 or whatever the joy one is, like through the roof, which is not like who I am at all." And so basically it was like God changed me. Like that's not my natural inkling, but that's who I am now. I'm a person of joy. But
Wow.
and he was astounded by that. And then apparently I didn't have any red flags at all, which again is like crazy for someone who grew up like me, all that kind of stuff. Like I turned out so well. He's like, I haven't seen an evaluation like this in 18 years or some ridiculous number like that. And I'm not trying to, this is not boasting, but I think, so then for me, I would go with just allowing God to do something in that life. Because if he can do this with my life, then he can, I know I'm a living proof that he can do whatever. And so I wouldn't take the opportunity away from God. We have disclaimer. I am not in any way saying that every one of those situations turns out well. I'm not proclaiming that at all.
No.
That would be really idiotic of me. But I do know situations where God redeems, right? And there's a lot of human element into that too. And there will always be, and that's kind of the thing. One of the reasons I think why I'm here is because of my grandmother. Her prayer and her guidance and her love and her character in my life was a huge deal in the face of all the stuff that was going on. So there are elements and there's things, but I think for me, if you end that life there and don't even give God the opportunity, then you don't even know what, like you cut it off before it started. So for me, because I just don't know what life is going to be like, I think I'd have to choose and say, well, I'd go the life route and see what God might do through it. So that's, for me, is a simplistic answer, but I think for me, those are the reasons why.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Pete. And your question reminded me of the scenario that I've heard comedians and philosophers talk about. If you could go back in time, would you murder Hitler when he's a baby? Right? Like, okay, you can just babies. You go back in time. You go in Hitler's room, right, in his cradle, and you can just strangle baby Hitler. And then, does that prevent the Holocaust? Nobody knows, right? So I think we again are definitely in a situation where we're tempted to play God rather than go through a trial and say, let God be God, right? Because you're right, that child coming into an unfortunate circumstance could become a criminal, could become a rapist, could become X, Y, and Z. But that's not for us to determine. So I know people would probably get really angry at me for saying, no, you don't kill baby Hitler. I mean, maybe I would feel different if he wiped out millions of Koreans. I don't know. But I say, no, you still don't kill baby Hitler if you can go back in time. Yeah, we're not here to determine who gets executed and who doesn't, and then use some kind of algorithm to figure out how much abuse or charity they're going to bring to the world. And I know it's just like Pete said, it's oversimplified, but I don't think that murder is justice or taking life is justice. I think even if there's a high probability that this life could take another life in the future of the future time, I still think, well, then let's try harder to love this baby, to nurture it, to bring it to health and restoration. Yeah. So, and I think if it was you, I think you would always say, "Let me live." Wouldn't you, Jenny? If you were the baby in your scenario, if you could speak for yourself, which the baby can't, is defenseless. Right? Think about what we're doing. It's the most defenseless thing in the world, a newborn baby or a baby in a baby in the womb. And we don't care about what it wants.
Yeah.
We only care about what we want. We put it on the altar of convenience and do what thou wilt, right? So I think we would always say, let me live, right? Even if I'm born blind or mentally challenged, I would always say, let me live. Give me a shot. Yeah, let's see what happens.
Yeah, because with the whole baby Hitler thing, that's fascinating. I think it's the first time I actually ever heard that. But just because you kill baby Hitler doesn't mean that you don't get another one just like him somehow or her, right?
Yeah.
Like
who
who's
knows?
to say that doesn't happen? That's number one. So
Yeah.
you can't, that isn't a guarantee, so you can't do that. And then of course, if you're, when you put it in the way that B just so poignantly did it, in terms of, babies and infants and people, babies in the womb being the most defenseless, those are the ones that God would defend. Like Scripture explicitly says, those are the ones that God would defend.
Amen.
Like, period. And so, I think that makes it fairly clear who God's going to side with, on that. And there's multiple scriptures about how He's always for the defenseless and the helpless, and He's not with the powerful, and things of that nature. And so, yeah, we can't do those things because you just have no idea. And then the really interesting thing, the videos that go trending on Facebook or YouTube, so many of them are the ones where you get, like, I don't know if you recently saw on America's Got Talent, there was this kid named Cody Lee. Have you seen that video?
No, I haven't seen
So
it.
he's this blind and autistic, like, 20-year-old or whatever, and then he comes out with his mom, and it was trending. It went to #1 for like a couple of days. It was ridiculous. I cried watching a YouTube video. My wife and I, we cried watching in our room, and he's autistic, but he sings like nobody's business. And there's something about that, right? Because everyone else gave up on. And then the mom came out, and I think he's actually like half Korean or something like that. His dad's Korean, I think mom's white or whatever. But his mom was saying how music, when they discovered that he was an entertainer, music saved his life. And then, of course, like, people are crying and all this stuff. And I think the reason why is because we see the value of the redemption in that, right? Like, if you knew, and let's say Cody doesn't do the music thing, then I think a lot of people would be like, well, then just abort him. Like, whatever. What is he going to do? He's going to cause pain on that family, financial stress, whatever, blah, 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 all this stuff. He's not going to be able to have a quality of life, so on and so forth. That would be the argument. Go ahead and get rid of him, and then what? But who knows what's going to happen through the hundreds of millions of views that video, right? What people are going to be impacted? What can God do that in the net that cast that we have no idea about? And so I think if you look at those things, just the possibility of what God can do in the world is so vast that you just have to side, I think, simplistically, yes, but also on some level, refreshingly, that you have to side with what God is able to do and live with it, right? Let God be God and come what may. That has to be the mentality, I think. If not, then He's not worth following. So, but you got to have it one way or the other. You're either going to let God be God and come what may, or you're going to say, God, I don't need you, and kind of do your own thing. You can't really play in the middle.
Yeah. I gotta watch that video.
Yeah, I'll show it to you later.
Yeah.
Unless we have a really pressing question, and if you do, please go ahead and ask it. If not, I think we'll just kind of finish up with a couple final remarks as we kind of get closer to the time here. So, any last questions? And by the way, you can always drop in a question a little later, and we can have a private one. But for the purposes of this recording, I think I'll start, and then B, I'll let you wrap it up for us, and then finish off. I think one thing that I am recognizing is not because I'm weird, but I love the fact that we can have discussions like this. And I wish that the church would be able to have more edifying and helpful discussions relating to stuff like this that have been problematic. And I feel like oftentimes we can't, even amongst the church, which is which is just really painful on a lot of different levels. But I think one thing that we're finding here at this retreat, and particularly between B and I, and just the way that we think is, man, the gospel is problematic. It's difficult in terms of the way that we always see it. And unless you start to reframe and reorient your life and the way that you think around the person that Jesus is and what He does, and really take it, and really just take it, even almost at face value, quote unquote, then you're not able to really understand what's going on. I think in today's discussion, the thing that I'm just kind of blown away, even with just the way that B and I have been talking about it, is just you're always going to run into this issue that God is God and I'm not. And people don't like it, but if you ain't God, then you ain't got much to say. I'm always kind of like, unless you can get to God's level, don't try to have that conversation with Him. You know what I mean? If you're not playing the same game, then, like, I'm not going to go out and try to, this is a stupid example, but I'm not going to go out and try and go, play, if I'm just really honest, I'm not going to go and try to play basketball with Michael Jordan. Like, I mean, let's be real. I think I'm good, but I think that the comparison is even crazier. Like, I'm not gonna go and try what's something I'm really terrible at. Like, I'm not gonna go and try like the archery thing. Like, I'm not gonna go and try and actually like hit a target and like and go at Olympians or whatever. Or like oh no, even better. I've been watching swimmers on YouTube because it's like the World Championships right now in Seoul, Korea, and like Michael Phelps's records that have been around for like 10 years are dropping like flies. This guy
Wow.
named Caleb Dressel is just killing it right now. I'm not gonna go and be like, yo, I'll race you in the 100-meter fly. Like, you freaking, I can't even do the butterfly stroke. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'd like drown. And I think that's kind of like what it is. Like, you know, don't try to, you know, I think on some level it's kind of like we can't have that conversation with him because we're just not on that level. But with what he's done and what he's shown, you know, I think we can trust him. And so if we can trust him, then I think we'll be okay. So I think that for me, that's kind of where I've always landed, and it's been freeing for me. So
Yeah, I think two proverbs that come to mind. The first one is in Proverbs 1:7, chapter 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. You know, those two proverbs really anchor me and give me the parameters to discuss these questions. You know, it's funny, he mentioned Avengers earlier in our podcast, and when I think about why was Avengers such a blockbuster hit and why did it destroy all the records, maybe I'm being overgeneralizing it, but I think we don't like the idea that there's something called predestination. We don't like the idea that somebody will predetermine things for you, because, you know, if you watch the Avengers, Thanos is the inevitable. He says, "I am inevitable," and that he is saying, "I'm God," right? In other words, and for the fact that fact of the matter is that the movie was really around how the Avengers are anti, in some sense, they're anti predestination. They're anti, like, I guess, Calvinism, for those who know what that means. And I can't go too much into it, but we don't like the idea that there is a singular being, namely God, that gets to determine what is right for the whole world.
Yep.
Because that's what Thanos was doing. He was determining what is right for the whole wide world and the galaxies. And so the Avengers got together and said, no,
yep.
that's not just.
Yep.
We don't want a being like that.
Yep.
Let's get rid of that being. And I think we're all like the Avengers in that respect. We're all trying to get rid of, we all want to be superheroes in our own right, and we all want to get rid of the God who determines where and how the world will end. Because the world is going to end. Everything ends. And one day these discussions will become insignificant. Yeah, and we don't really want to accept that. You know, God will be God, like Pastor Pete says. So I love talking about these things, but we have to remember that, you know, our opinion doesn't matter as much as we think it does. Yeah, he is Lord.
Yeah. And when you say Jesus is Lord, that means every other thing is no longer Lord, including yourself. I learned that, and again, that's a tough pill to swallow. That's a mic drop for you in the podcast world when you equate God to Thanos. And then you have to have everyone think about it, be like, yo, what did he just do? But that's B for you. So again, B, thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Thanks, bro. Thanks for having me. Y'all are wonderful.
Really awesome. When this retreat is over, I feel like I'm gonna go home and be like, I need more B in my life. Hey Chris, can you kind of set it up so that we can kind of do this more often, like, you know, remote, like he can be in Atlanta, I can be in, you know, kind of do the Skype thing, because I know people do that. We're gonna have to do this and make it a regular. I think it's gonna become something. But anyways, thank you B so much for this. Really had a great time. So signing off for another episode of The Well. Thank you for everyone who's here for this Real Talk, and see you next time. Bye.
All right, y'all.